All right, people, we're here. I've got my brand new setup almost officially ready to go, and we're here to get a little bit spooky tonight because, Chris, did the devil make you do it?
Yeah, Dom, I can confirm the devil is in fact making me podcast tonight.
The devil is in fact making you podcast. People, we're just a couple of sinners here, ready to give you guys your normal, regular, every week podcast. This is Conjuring Devil Made Me Do It. We'll see you guys there. Well, Chris, it feels like we were just quite literally sitting here, although not quite in this spot. I was kind of back there, like right behind me, but I was on an inflatable mattress instead of my actual bed frame. And so you can imagine why, even though this episode will be up 3 days later, why I'm getting this crazy sense of deja vu about this.
Right. I mean, hey, man, look, at least your new setup is looking great. And you
Thanks,
thankfully, I'm sure, have enough holy water around. God forbid something happens.
Hopefully. Well, I mean, I got a water bottle right here, but it's empty, and I don't know if it's filled with holy water. So, we'll just have to wait.
Well, you're not supposed to drink it, so.
That is true. That is true. We're just supposed to use it as like a protective ring. And people, in case you didn't know, in case you weren't aware of our average everyday annual daily podcast, this is, of course, the Talkin TV podcast. I'm Dom, the movie nerd, and that's Chris, the TV nerd. We're just a regular couple of sinners here to talk about, quite possibly, Chris, I don't really know how to categorize this one because, I feel like it does everything that it's supposed to, but in a strange way, it feels underwhelming. You ever felt that way before?
Yeah, many times.
Yeah,
and
it's not a good feeling.
Yeah, this is just the most recent installment because I think I echo that sentiment. While I don't think I'm as hard on it as maybe you are in that initial very vague phrasing, I certainly can't say I don't see where you're coming from. And to go even further, I can't say that I don't share some of the same feelings. So,
yeah,
I mean, shall we just get into the thing?
Yeah, let's dive into it. So people, as you know, last Friday we talked about The Conjuring 1 and 2 as part of our retrospective, and tonight we're talking about Conjuring Part 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, which of course dropped directly on HBO Max. This one, despite the fact that Wan returned for the script, this one was not directed by James Wan. In fact, it was directed by another director from within the Conjuring universe, the director of Curse of La Llorona, which I have to still see whether or not La Llorona is actually part of this franchise or not. I don't actually remember off the top. It is? Okay. Yeah. I wasn't sure because I was trying to keep track of all of them, and there's like 8 or 9
and I've heard
it's
like one of the worst received ones too.
Yeah,
outside of,
it's like the second worst received. It's like the second or third received one besides like the Nun and Annabelle, the first Annabelle, which is widely been considered to be like one of the worst movies of 2014 when it came out. But it was directed by the guy's name is Michael Chaves. Michael Chaves, who was the director of Curse of La Llorona. And Chris, did you watch La Llorona?
No, I think I'm going to torture myself, though, and just go back and complete this universe, because I've already seen The Nun, so I've seen half of the films, and at this point, it's like, I might as well
finish it. You're a completist. I get it. I am one as well. I'll begrudgingly finish franchises even if they come to a crappy end. Cough, Star Wars. But easy shot. I know, but I am a completionist, or Lost. But yeah. So we have
I'll disagree with you there because
I
Lost finale is.
I know.
Cinema gold.
It's about as
TV
emotionally
gold.
It's about as emotionally manipulative as you can get. But so we have this third movie, right? Which is both it's like the 8th or 9th installment in the Conjuring franchise, and it's the third installment overall in the trilogy. And as I said, I believe, and I did my research too in order to back on my point from Friday, I still believe that this is the only threequel besides John Wick 3 that introduces the subtitle into the franchise entirely. So it kind of gets points for creativity there. But I guess if we're gonna kick it off right with our spoiler-free thoughts, my whole thing that I immediately noticed with the start of this movie is, okay, so the interesting thing that these movies have done, I think, is that even though they maintain, I would say, a fairly similar story, they've made it because of the kind of the anthological aspect of it, right? Similar to certain other anthological shows like Black, that would revolve around like one character that would go from like different setting to different setting to different setting to different setting. The setting can kind of like warp and adjust around what the story actually calls for, right? But with this time around, it's kind of warps in a way that I don't know if it's necessarily the fact that it's not as well written as the first two, but it definitely warps in a way that kind of comes off as like a little bit cheesier and schlockier and almost a little bit lower than like what this franchise is normally hitting at before, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like just like what I use to like break open the ice, if you will.
No, I think it's a great icebreaker because, like I said in our intro here, I definitely echo similar sentiments to you. But just knowing you and sort of the way that these types of podcasts go, and we have a similar feeling about a film that kind of maybe left us wanting more or was underwhelming, or at least with how good these first two are, really had a high bar set for it. I think we're going to differ on what we disliked about it, and so I'll start with what I agree with you on is that, yeah, I was trying to think what is the aspect of this film that makes it a little bit lackluster, maybe not stand as tall up next to its two predecessors, which I've come around on it. I know on our Friday night stream, guys, I sort of said that I thought they were great, but something about them was stopping them from being perfect movies. And I think it's because I realized how important the theater-going experience is to specifically the horror genre, and honestly, all film
Especially
in general.
The horror genre.
But especially to the horror genre, but I'm not going to let that sort of stand in the way of the fact that they are perfect movies. So I have come around to that and made my peace with it. I wasn't around when they were in theaters as far as being a film lover and a film critiquer goes, so I wouldn't have seen them, and that's just something I can't fix, so I'm not going to lament on it. But now having the chance to have this third one and given the option to watch it at home or in theaters, I chose to watch it at home just to complete the trilogy the way I had watched it. And so putting myself in the same situation as the first two, I thought to myself, well, James Wan is attached to this, but he's attached to this in different ways. He's the writer and the producer here. Well, one of the writers and one of the producers. But I'm sure being that this franchise is his baby, really, it's he's got to have a hefty hand in those roles. But I think this is where you kind of learn, because you and I, we've listened to a lot of interviews, we've taken classes. Sometimes the screenwriter is like pissed that the movie was made because it wasn't made the way that he thought it was going to be made, and it flops and it makes him look bad because it's out of his hands at that point. And so I think that Michael Chaves took a lot of liberties that I think on the page made for a really interesting, kind of like A Quiet Place, a different turn for another installment, taking the horror genre and sort of getting out of the haunted house and getting a little more like occult murder mystery style, but still a solid story, because like Krasinski had a solid story for A Quiet Place 1 and 2, even though those are two drastically different tonal movies. I think the same thing is present here. And I think this, I mean, I want you to I'm passing it over to you now, but I don't want to blame anyone because I still, for the most part, enjoyed watching this movie. But I do think something went wrong, and I think it might be this Chaves guy, unfortunately.
So I wanted to real quick just bounce off another point that you brought up from last night, which was the idea of kind of, the need to see these movies in the theaters versus at home, and kind of the convenience factor of it at home, right? And I mentioned a point where it's like, okay, it's really a 50-50 shot because you don't know until you actually watch the movie. It became almost immediately apparent to me that I'm like, yeah, I can watch this at home as background noise, and I'll still like get exactly everything that I need to from this movie, right? And that's like automatically thing number one that kind of showed me that like, oh, it doesn't have the same kind of majesty as the first two, as far as like, even though you could tell like the low budget fare of it, it's still the fact that like it's shot in a way that feels cinematic, if that makes any sense. Versus this one, I think right off the bat, the thing that's more noticeable to me is it feels more like a TV movie, And obviously we have to take into consideration all the things that go into the shooting of this movie, but like it looks flatter. The colors look more like a TV palette almost. The cinematography is flashy and interesting at certain points, but in like a Marvel way where it's just like, oh, we're kind of just showing off, and there's not really like necessarily a reason as to behind the camera shots. Versus in the first two, it definitely feels like there is intent put behind each one of those cameras, and so I think that like, while I think that your point about Chaves is great as well, because it kind of shows it's like, okay, this is the difference between somebody who is experienced and has purpose and intent with everything that he does in filmmaking versus somebody who, again, I didn't watch La Llorona, but just based off everything I heard about it, is kind of just trying to make like something that's shocking and that will constantly keep your attention,
Yeah. I wanted to fight you on the whole it feels like a TV movie, but then the more I hear you explain it and the more I think about it, there are TV isms, but I still wouldn't go as far as to say that.
Right.
I
So
still
that
think
that
that,
that's bad terminology. And just as far as like kind of I feel like kind of the structuring of it and like the way that like certain of the shots I'm like, I kind of see that in like TV shows. It's not to like downgrade it to like TV quality, but like I'm talking about as far as like there is a distinct difference between the way certain television shows are shot versus movies are shot. That's strictly from like a craft and lens standpoint.
so yeah, I think, and what we do have a segment prepared for James Wan later, so we'll really dive in and dissect that in just a little bit, guys. Please stick with us. But I can at least say now, without sort of spoiling anything, ironically enough, in the spoiler-free segment, that I think even though Wan has a few at-bats where he swung and missed, The Nun and I believe the second Insidious wasn't all that well received. I've still yet to watch those, and a few other films too. I mean, he's done quite a few at this point. Chaves, this is his third film. This is his third
Yeah.
feature. And
Yeah.
so I was
He's
impressed thinking that and hearing that. And I think, creative people tend to keep other creative people around. I'm sure that Juan wouldn't entrust just anyone with the third film. I
right.
mean, sure, he's busy working on Aquaman, and there's reasons, right, why he couldn't. And he's waited too long at this point, anyways, to put a third one out. So there's reasons
Right.
why he couldn't helm this one.
Right.
And we got to keep that in mind. But to pick Chavez, I mean,
Yeah. It's like, dude,
he had to have seen something.
I guess, but like, if you just look at like the again, I hate referring to Rotten Tomato scores for anything, but it's like if you look at like the ratings overall from like the best in this kind of overall shared universe of movies to the worst, it's like La Llorona comes in at like number 3 from the worst. It's like Annabelle, The
Yeah.
Nun, and La Llorona. Like that's not a good sign as far as that goes, you know?
Right. No, and that's what I've been sort of scratching my head about, and that's why I now want to watch La Llorona. Probably just to torture myself. But you know what this is all telling me, Dom. It seems like the spoiler-free section has run its course,
Yes.
and we can further sort of crack this chestnut
Yes,
in
let's
later
get into talking about
sections.
this movie. Let's get into talking about this movie.
Yeah, definitely. So, guys, let us know your spoiler-free thoughts below, of course, and please like, subscribe, and turn the bell on to this video and this channel. It would mean a lot and really help us out. So yeah, Dom, take us into the next segment, man. Let's get into this thing.
So almost immediately, right? So we have the overall central plot of this movie, which is that the Warrens this time have to solve a case of potential witchcraft, right? It's actually interesting because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this might be the first time in the franchise where the opening scene, which is usually kind of like separate and kind of like a thing to like sort of introduce the movie, is actually used within the rest of the movie, right? As far as like kind of the first two Conjurings, the way that they opened up is that the Warrens were kind of off doing something different while the main plot thing was kind of unraveling on its own, and then the Warrens usually become involved like around like the beginning / like more so towards the middle of the movie, right? This time around, we open with the Warrens, and not only that, but the plot, as far as that goes, about this demonic possession, supposedly, of this teenage kid that results in him almost murdering, his girlfriend, ends up like playing into the rest of the movie as far as, okay, so now he's in jail, and the majority of the movie is almost like this kind of like really weird, interesting courtroom case where the Warrens have to go and prove that this has happened to other people, so that way they can prove the kid innocent, and along the way they get into some really, really hokey shit involving a former preacher whose daughter, spoilers, but turns out to be a witch. Like it gets into like all sorts of like ridiculous direction that I'm like, okay, I give it props for like kind of trying to do the bigger, bolder thing and continue to do with this franchise, but like, I don't know, Chris, is it just me, or is this starting to sound like there's a little bit too much plot going on here?
Yeah, well, listen, we're obviously comparing it now to its predecessors, which were two gigantically successful horror films. I mean, the first one, when I went back and sort of read some articles, did some homework and preparation for this, I mean, it seems like you were hard-pressed to find someone who didn't receive this movie very positively. And rightfully so. It's a solid film. The problem and why it's always going to be hard, I think, to compare these two films outside of just the James Wan of it all and his touch being so masterful and really being able to see when he's behind the camera versus when someone else is, I think it's because we really changed direction here. We shifted gears. We went from being haunting films, haunted houses, jump scares, relying on using children to sort of plan our emotions so we feel for the children. It's terrible that they're being tortured. And yeah, there's still children in this one. But we're not in this bottled sort of one house, or this bottled sort of one street in England anymore. We're more exploring, and we're kind of also not seeing the Warrens as these secondary characters. The families in the first two, in my opinion, really are the lens of which we're looking through. We've shifted gears completely. So we went from being haunted movies where we're focusing on the family and the Warrens are coming in to help, to now we are sort of turning into like a thriller, a horror thriller, sort of like murder mystery, detective style movie, where instead of looking through the lens of the family, sure, they're present and we feel for them, we're looking through the lens of the Warrens trying to solve them to then help the family. So we've kind of like shifted the pieces around a little bit, which, hey, I think they could have honestly made another film very similar to the first two and probably would have been better off. It seems like they're getting roasted on the internet. I do respect the tonal change at this point, especially because for some reason there's a cinematic universe around these films. So
somehow it's the silent cinematic universe that we didn't know about, right? Marvel obviously was the big one, right? DC was the one that tried and failed. Sony and Universal and the Dark Universe were the ones that were just never even a thing before they even started, right? And then you have Godzilla, and then you have the Monsterverse, which just recently announced its shared cinematic universes, but in a way that like kind of worked because there were so far fewer movies. And then you have this one where it's like, okay, there are all these different movies and they just don't mention how they're interconnected, and they just like actually, it's weird because it's like the only franchise that like actually has the foresight to only use the hidden clues and the Easter eggs within the movie as connections to the other movies. They don't necessarily need to build it in as elements of their plot, which is kind of how they're able to get away with this interesting mix, right? Like that's the beautiful thing about watching the movies, is you can watch the Conjuring movies without actually having to watch the Annabelle movies, right? But if you do watch them, you'll get like all this different like interesting rich and backstory. But it's not like a Star Wars or a Marvel thing where it's like, okay, you really have to have seen all these other things in order to know who this character is and what's going on, And as far as the whole thing with the Warrens, you're right, the tonal shift in and of itself as an idea is an interesting change. The problem is within its application, right? I don't think it entirely works, because while the structure is sound, the actual things that are happening within the structure are kind of lackluster and kind of hokey, and it almost feels like it's trying to be like a more schlocky, like B-level movie, rather than like, I'm not gonna say like serious thoroughfare, but like the first two were like trying to be like these really interesting art films, really, right?
That I was gonna ask you, like, how would you categorize them? Because I would say they're like prestige horror. Honestly.
I agree. The first two are prestige horror, and this one is more of like kind of like a schlocky, campy B movie. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna lie. I was getting Black Christmas vibes.
Oh, no, not that bad.
Not nearly to that extent, because like this still like what clearly was made by a much more competent filmmaker, because say what you will, but Michael Chaves did train under gun, so he knows what he's doing way more than whoever the fuck directed Black Christmas. But there were points where I'm like, oh, this is getting really schlocky. The good thing is that with the way that it was filmed, it reminded me more of Gretel and Hansel, as far as another like recent movie that I saw that like it had involved witchcraft, and that movie was beautifully shot. Those like they're like these weird, like kind of off kilter like A24 movies that aren't A24 movies. Like Gretel and Hansel was one, Mainstream was one, but. Yeah. Like, you kind of think of it that way, and you're like, oh, no. Like, once they reveal... Hold on, wait. Like, I just gotta finish this point. Once they reveal that the villain, the antagonist at the end, is an actual, honest-to-God witch, like, I legitimately... I'm like, I don't know how to feel right now. I legitimately don't know how to feel right now.
Yeah... It was strange to not have it be something of the paranormal,
right?
Because that's what we know about these films.
Not necessarily of the paranormal, but the shift from the paranormal to the occult, making the occult an actual part of this movie, Because you'd think that the two of them would sync together nicely. They strangely enough don't. Not as much as you would think, right?
Yeah, and here's the thing. Not that I've studied the occult or the paranormal outside of just being a fan of Hollywood and watching what they give me, but I can say that it almost felt like the demonic aspects of the occult were there to sort of say to the audiences who were coming, because they love 1 and 2 so much, the first films, hey, we still have something here for you, even though we know we're changing it up a bit. It did feel like maybe it would it, because I think honestly, if it would have just dug its heels into this witchcraft thing, since so much of the story was based on that, and had it sort of been like a battle of the minds, right? Like who was going to win? Is it going to be the Warrens, or is it going to be this witch woman who was raised by the priest and feels slighted by her upbringing? You know, like I think that would have been much more interesting, because take out the paranormal aspects, you know, the few times we
Right.
have some of the more demonic
Right.
scares, it's still a dark, creepy movie.
Oh, it is, without a doubt.
You know, it's
Yeah.
so, you know, with all that said, this is actually great, because my question that I wanted to ask still, I think, holds like a solid place in the conversation. So, do you respect the change? Do you respect the shift, or what's your take on that?
I respect the inherent change in idea in the shift, and the decision to pursue more of the occult rather than the straight up supernatural, which they have done in the first two movies. I respect the decision. I don't respect certain elements of the story where it's like, oh, she's going to confront the one guy who seemed kind of shady, and then of course it turned out he was, and then he just dies. And I'm like, but not before he gives a big grand old monologue about how the mistakes of his past have resulted in this current evil that they're dealing with. And I'm like, okay, like this franchise, and quite frankly, well, okay, not this franchise, but this set of movies in particular is above that sort of like, rigmarole, if you will. And like those are just the parts of the movies that like made me roll my eyes in the way that like the first one, if we're just taking that as an isolated cause, like legitimately wowed me at, you know?
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. It's like I respect the direction. I just think the execution steps on its toes, and I think that's obviously abundant to the. I mean, look, man, even my non-critic friends who have seen this are like, it's different in a weird way. Like, not the most eloquent answer. They're not critics,
right?
But like,
but
they're not
you still get the idea.
They're not for it. Now, before we jump into another segment, my next question for you that kind of ties off this.
I think this is the first time where it's like you're interrogating me instead of me interrogating you. I feel like it's a like good how it's switched around.
You know, I had a long day at work. It was blisteringly hot, and I was able to really think about this movie.
It was the complete opposite. It was super boring for me because there was literally no one in my store the entire day, but I still was able to think about this movie. The problem was I didn't think about it nearly as much because I'm like, man, I'm struggling hard to remember most of the stuff about this movie other than like the crazy moments.
Oh man, yeah, I feel that. But no, like what I wanted to ask you was like with the whole sort of tonal shift, do you think that maybe we didn't? Because I almost wonder. I respect them for trying something new, bringing in more of the occult. In my opinion, having it be more of like a murder mystery sort of thriller chase type film, like finding who's responsible for this. But I almost think this is a franchise where they could have gotten away with just like another Warren case of the same old in a different town, because they're so well made, right?
Or I'll take it one step further, right? Obviously, besides bringing Wan back as a director, right, regardless of whether he wanted to do it, I think the approach is off, right? I personally think you could have the occult be a part of this movie while not having it be the focus of this movie, if it makes sense, right? Rather than it be like a mystery where they're like hopping from place to place trying to solve the clues, making it almost like a schlocky Scooby-Doo hunt. I think, because I actually saw this idea online, and I think that this actually works way better for this movie, which is where you have it be this legal drama where, again, like bear with me here, but where it takes place in the court case, but then you bring in the elements of the occult. And the reason why I bring that up is because there's precedence for this working in movies, because that's literally the plot of The Devil's Advocate. You just, instead of having the ridiculously over-the-top ending with Pacino yelling about how he's a fan of man, you know, you have it be like this exorcism / weird pursuit of like the witch. You could have it be like where they're trying to exorcise the kid while the witch is trying to pursue them at the same time, right? Add tension on top of tension. Like, I hate to be like pitching a better movie, but like, I don't know. Does that help? Does that really answer your question?
It answers my question that there clearly was a problem in regards to the directional shift, because it seems like the tone was never fully established.
Right.
And, you know, you bring up the courtroom drama. You've brought it up twice. It seems like you really felt the courtroom drama. Dude, to be honest with you, that was the smallest portion of the film, and I think they could have done without it because of how little they dug their heels into it.
Right, and that's the problem, because the problem is that the whole thing that this is based off is the court case, right? This is the first time in these specific movies that they have, you know, utilized the court case as a part of the demonic cult of possession, right? The first two were mostly isolated in the locations where they took place, right? And so I think if you brought in that element, that I think would have been a way to like almost kind of continue this weird level of prestige that these movies have built up with this shift in tone and direction, right? But because they chose not to focus on that, and again, you're right, because they chose to make that such a small part of the movie, it feels more like an afterthought. And until we get into, again, like this goofy, for lack of a better word, Scooby-Doo hunt, and now they're just having a beat where it's like the whole... This is another part, and we'll get into this in a later segment, but this is another thing that I kind of was starting to feel the way that you did with that first movie of, like, the Warrens, but in a different way, where you thought that the Warrens were kind of like the flattest part about the first one, and while I do see where you're coming from, but there, I thought the Warrens are just like, okay, so they're just straight up, like, daredevils now. Like, Elaine is like Elaine is literally chasing the high of her visions because she's so enraptured by kind of like the power that she gets from them, literally to the point where she puts her husband in danger multiple times. And then now you have Ed, who's practically on the verge of having a heart attack throughout the movie, literally to the point where he has like multiple, like, how many does he have in this movie? It's kind of ridiculous, to the point where I'm like, they kind of end it with like, not even like kind of the bow tie on top, kind of just like with like the documentary crawling up from the bottom. And I'm like, I'm left with this really weird, strange feeling where I'm like, what is happening with these two, you know?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. It's, so I think while we're still in the comparison phase, right, the first two to the third one, say what you will, at least, and I still stand by my sentiment where I did think the weakest performances of the cast, the central cast in the first film, were the Warrens. They were still enjoyable. It's still a really great film for me. Like, it still ranks high. It's just that I was so invested that I liked that movie so much that I just want to like it even more because that's how much I liked it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so, because it's weird, us humans, we can do things like that just don't make sense, but we're able to compartmentalize like that. So I want to make sure it comes across to our listeners so they're on the same page with me. And so while I felt that way about the first one, the second one I thought was perfect all around. I was fully invested in all of the characters, and I thought it was a phenomenal just process from page to screen. And the third one, I think the problem is the only characters that really get developed are the Warrens, and they're not developed in this film, in my opinion.
No,
they're developed from previous movies.
Yes.
So you have a larger cast than we've ever seen. Now you have this town. I know nothing about this town. All I know is from the end that this is the first time there was a murder ever made in this town from this case. Great. You probably should have told me that in the beginning. Second of all, it's just like, this is messy. We got bigger, but we didn't do the work to make it justified, in my opinion.
It's a bad episode of Mindhunter without David Fincher's precision, is what it is. Because there are literally sequences in this movie where I feel like, oh man, he just watched Mindhunter and he loved the sequences of Holden and the other FBI officer walking through the woods, having this really intense conversation, and he's definitely going to try and mimic that. Like, that's what it felt like in the scene in the woods where they're walking, and then she has the vision of the demon, and she almost gets pulled off the cliff, where I'm like, okay, like, we've seen those demons do some crazy shit with Elaine in this movie, but we're getting to just straight up just like X-Men shit as far as that goes, where you're just like having them like jump into different bodies, and you're having them like literally like get pulled and manipulated by spirits, and Ed is like battling this like giant freaking like mega demon. I'm like, when did this turn into freaking Army of the Dead? Like, this is getting ridiculous.
It was some Stranger Things bullshit, that one scene where like Eleven's picking up the kids and Mike's like, put them down. Like, it was like, that works for Stranger Things. We're talking about kids in a completely different universe.
Right.
Anyways, I think our comparisons are over. I'd say we should move into our Warren-specific segment, if you're cool with that.
Because in case it wasn't pretty obvious, I don't think this compares well to the first two.
Yeah, I would say that's...
As if that wasn't completely obvious enough from the points that we brought up already.
I would say that's the general consensus of the segment. I think it's hilarious how direct you were in that. By the way,
I have to be.
I'm muting out just because, like, I'm, good podcasting form when you're tweaking. But, like, just so people who aren't watching the video, I'm, like, laughing a lot during this one. Dom's comparisons are so cold-hearted. Like, you're really... the way you're just, like, digging into this movie right now is hilarious to me.
I kind of had a lot of time on my hands to think about it today. So I kind of like, I'm like, okay, if this is the new mindset as far as a new location, new mindset, I'm down with it. I didn't want to draw too much attention to it at the risk of jinxing myself, but
no, I'm into it. It makes sense. And I think it's kind of the It's the talking to that this movie deserves after how good the first two were, I would say.
And
So
the sad part is, I'm not even gonna give it that bad of a rating. Like I still don't. This still isn't to me like worst of the year material. Not even close. But like,
right, for sure.
Yeah.
Because that's the problem with this franchise.
Yeah.
So far.
Well, this whole cinematic universe, I would say, not this specific franchise. But
all right, so
we'll get into the next topic. That's basically how much it compares to the first two. So
yeah, I'm sure you guys really don't disagree with us. But honestly, if you do, if there's ever a time to like be that YouTuber who's like, let me know in the comments. Now is when I want to know if you're like, if there's anyone out there who's like, you guys are stupid. This is the best one. That is insane to me.
Oh man, I hope so.
I
hope that we get that comment too. But yeah, so be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already as we move on to our next segment, Chris, which is the Warrens. We talked about them a little bit in our last segment, but I'm like, what the fuck happened here? You know, like I'll admit that like part of the thing that got me like really invested in them in the first two is the fact that like they really were like the first movie couple that I've seen that were like on the same page and not in like a super forced, obnoxious movie way. You know, like they actually had like a shared interest, but both had like their own individual personalities that made them. You know, like Ed is more of like a churchgoer, and Lorraine is definitely more interested in like the supernatural aspect. But because they've got their own individual strengths, they complement each other on a scale that really I don't think can be compared to any other movie. And that combined with their own emotional strife is to me what has allowed me to become engaged with those two specifically throughout these movies. And here it's like problem number one with Elaine, besides the fact that her powers, like I said before, are literally X-Men level this time, is that she's just doing all these things that are deliberately putting Ed in danger. Like, and I'm not saying that facetiously. She literally like almost accidentally kills him multiple times, you know. Granted, the favor is exchanged, right? He almost accidentally kills her once as well. But like, it's getting to the point where I'm like, okay, you guys are getting into like some midlife crisis type shit here, because this is getting ridiculous. Like, this is getting to the point where it's like you guys are literally just doing this for like attention at this point, you know. And I guess that it's so disheartening because I'm like, part of, you know, my vested interest among the multiple other things that I thought were better about the first one was their kind of both individual vested interest in the occult. And now that we're kind of getting into this like schlocky Daredevil level, it's like, in addition to the many other problems that I have with this movie, the character work just doesn't feel the same, you know?
Yeah, so just so you guys know, the only reason my phone's out is because I wrote some notes on the Warrens in specific. So I'm breaking good showman form so I can make sure that what I'm telling you right now is exactly the way I had written it down at work. But before I get into my notes, I have to agree. It's like they're doing a bit. It's like they watched some classic Abbott and Costello, and they're like, cool, like now when I do this, you jump and they'll laugh or something like that. Like, it's just so stupid. Like, they're just playing this game of cat and mouse that they don't need to be playing. And it's frustrating to watch. I personally felt that way because what I wrote down was, and I think the reason why I thought they felt flat, because I did have a bit of a change of heart on that, and I was saving it for this segment. I think it's because movies and film and just entertainment in general, it's obviously a dramatization of real life. And so it's rare when a film can capture an ebb and flow of the couples we see every day on screen. And I genuinely, looking back, think I was a little off-put by the chemistry between Ed and Lorraine Warren, because it wasn't like movie chemistry. It legitimately felt like they were married. Yes. And that was strange to me, especially in horror, because like, I'm going to say something crazy, and I don't think I'm going to regret it tomorrow morning. If I do, just check my Twitter. I'll tweet it out. I think that like, these aren't just prestige horror films. These are like classy horror films. The first two.
Yes.
They have like,
I agree with that 100%.
And it's just like, James Wan. Like, wow, okay, I did not expect this. And so they feel too real, and I think it makes it all the more scarier. And so in the third one, you know, Chaves doesn't have to do much homework. That's already established. And him dropping the ball on it was so frustrating because he's speaking a lot about Vera Farmiga's superpowers in this movie. And it's not like those are hidden. They were there in the first two, except we didn't see the sequences, right? We kind of used.
It was projected more in a way that felt like more like empath level, which is something that I know, which is like, okay, you read somebody else's emotions, but here it's like straight up just visions and like hallucinations and like body jumping. Like we get into fucking like her just jumping around into different bodies in this one, like some Professor X shit right there.
Yeah, it's Assassin's Creed. She goes, she can see like the blueprint. She can see like the steps. She goes into like the middle realm and she can like piece it all together.
That's it.
And I think it really diminishes her character. I think it takes her from, and like the whole plot line of the cops needing her to prove that she's this person she is, and they can't solve the case and she does, and like confirming what we already saw in the first two. I'm sorry, but we already knew this, first of all. Second of all, it's like, why would you shift who she is so much? You know, we completely, and those sequences, not only did they shift who she was and make her a comic book character as opposed to a real person who I literally felt like I could have met on the street after watching the first two, just an average everyday human being, not the megastar that is Vera Farmiga, right? Like I genuinely felt that that's who she was off the first two. Now she feels like DC's Constantine or something, like a CW show that's like trying to get its legs and get another season.
In this case, she is the Zatanna to Ed's Constantine, is what I would say.
Yes, exactly. And let's talk about Ed. He went from. I thought it was actually interesting. You know, they aged, and I thought they actually did a good job addressing the 10 years.
I agree.
That was good. I liked that.
I like that. That was well done. And then Ed is literally turned into his character from Watchmen, where he's literally just a punching bag for the first 2/3 of the movie until the last act where he's like, hey, I'm actually going to do something now. And he like waddles around because he can like barely move because his heart's literally about to give out. So
yeah. And I mean, look, Ed was still strong. He was still cunning, and she was sort of still like all the missing pieces to him. But they just made them. At the same time, it was the same characters we know and love, but they weren't acting like themselves. It was almost like they were the ones who were possessed, and they were doing things that we hadn't seen them do before. And I get it, this is like the biggest case ever, but they're still the same people, right? Like, I don't know, what's your take on all that?
No, I agree with you. It's kind of, it's always jarring to me when like you have like these shifts in characterization to the point where they don't feel like the same characters that you started off with, you know, right? There's kind of this rule, or this kind of unspoken rule in TV, right? Which specifically long-running TV show forms, right? Which is where you kind of have to excuse the first season, not necessarily because the first season can still be good, right? But usually part of the interest of a TV show is seeing the characters in the first season versus in the last season to see how they grow and change, which in a way also reflects the actors, because the actors are getting to know the character and becoming more comfortable with it, which is usually why even if the quality of the overall show goes down in the last couple seasons, the acting is pitch perfect, you know? But the interesting phenomenon is that with movies, it's almost kind of like the opposite, where because, right, movies were initially conceived to only have like one story told within 2 hours, right? You have this case of where people get so used to the character and embodying them for that little bit of time. But then they have to do it again, right, for sequels, and you start to see changes in characteristics, sometimes not necessarily for the best, right? It's changed a lot, and it's definitely gotten to the point where it's like, yeah, actors can definitely carry it across multiple films. Just look at the Marvel movies, right? Those are, again, like with as many faults as we have with those movies, again, part of the reason, of many reasons why those movies worked is because they were... those actors were able to maintain the characteristics that people like, that they put into those characters across 10 years, you know? And here, it's just gone in the complete opposite wrong direction. You know, you literally have like these two very endearing, very charming, very intelligent characters that are just making dumb decisions and starting to act like generic horror movie characters per se, you know, because it's almost like they become self-aware of their invulnerability, right? The reason why we can laugh at Vin Diesel doing it in the Fast and Furious is because those movies kind of, they allow the characters to, strangely enough, grow and change with the movies, because as the stunts and the overall action gets more and more ridiculous, the inherent self-awareness of the characters and vulnerability gets more and more ridiculous, and it kind of creates for like this perfect insane synergy. Versus here, it's like they're still trying to keep the tone mostly grounded, but the characters are starting to get over the top. The scenarios in the world are starting to get over the top. It's like there isn't like that kind of perfect synergy that you want from your movies.
Yeah, they're not. You hit the nail on the head, I think, with the Fast and Furious comparison, because I think those movies, Vin Diesel grows with the scope of the property. Paul Walker
Yes.
grew with the scope of the property. And
Vin Diesel was a human being in those movies at one point before he evolved into the god-esque figure that he is by the time where we are in the franchise.
Right, but when he evolved to that god-esque figure, the scenarios he's in require a god, whereas before, someone on the street could have gotten the job done.
Yes.
And we don't have that progression here. You know,
Yes,
we
agreed.
take I would say, not a bold step. We've seen third installments or second installments of, I mean, hell, we saw one last week with Quiet Place. They took a different step in a familiar world tonally. The thing about that movie now, the more I keep looking back and referring to it, those characters grew with the scenario. It all coalesced together. Whereas here, and I think
It's
we're
like
pretty close to our next.
It's like they're devolving.
It's like they're devolving, and so I can't elaborate on that anymore without speaking about the directors here. So do you want to pop into the next segment?
Yes, please. So we're doing, is this change of tone or is this the change in directors?
This is going to be the final segment that we have written down, which is a combination of both. It's the change of the tone and the director shift. So with that being said, guys, just what to do. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell. We got to get into the segment and keep on the ball. Dom, I'm passing it off to you, man.
Yes, indeed. So the shift in directors. We've seen this happen with multiple other franchises. It's not the first time it's happened. It has almost always been to the detriment of the franchise, because before Marvel came around and proved that they could just literally do anything, right? They could shift directors, they could shift tone, whatever, they could shift storyline, they could even shift out actors, because they recast two of the big heavy hitters in the MCU from within their initial installments to their subsequent installments, with Don Cheadle and Mark Ruffalo replacing Terrence Howard and Edward Norton, respectively. But it's almost always to the detriment, right? The guy who came in to direct Terminator 3 after James Cameron left for Terminator 2, Terminator 3 was what it was. I've heard it's one of the better received ones of all the post-T2 Terminator movies, and it certainly does better than McG, Alan Taylor, and, Tim Miller as far as that goes. But, David Fincher coming in, the Alien franchise is kind of a weird example, because in that one, it's kind of the studio screwing with it, not necessarily the shift in director, and also because Alien already had the precedent of shifting directors, right? There are franchises that make it work. It's a different case-by-case basis, but this is definitely one instance where I can definitively say, because horror has a long-running track record of this, that the shift in directors kind of killed the momentum that we had going from those first two movies, right? Because the first one happens, you think, oh, wow, this was such an awesome self-contained story. There's no way they could possibly top this. And then the second one comes out, and while it's not as good as the first one, it's definitely okay, they could actually, keep this going, because the second one comes out and you're like, holy shit, this is awesome. And then the third one comes out and there's a shift in directing, and it's immediately noticeable. It kind of shifts the tone in a way that's not really, that effective towards the story. And yeah, it doesn't work ultimately, I think.
Yeah, but the reason why I'd say it doesn't quite literally fall on its face like other scenarios where we've seen this happen is because we still have some of James Wan there. I mean, that's at least why I believe that it's not as pathetic as maybe we're making it seem. It's just that I loved the first two so much that I have to be hard on this third one because of how good they are in a medium that is... If there was ever a medium that had cinematic universes before cinematic universes, it's horror films. I mean, look at Elm Street, the Friday the 13th, Halloween quite literally has whatever.
How many movies are in that franchise, even with the reboots? It's
they
more
rise
than
to Marvel.
It's more than Nightmare and Friday the 13th, right?
It's 13 or something.
Chucky's got 8 installments, and they got a reboot too. They finally got their reboot last year, 2 years ago. I heard it was one of the better ones. It was better than the Friday the 13th and the Nightmare on Elm Street remakes that they tried in 2009 and 10.
Yeah, I heard those. I heard that too about the Chucky, although that little doll does not interest me at all. Not like Annabelle does.
Interesting.
And so here's the thing. The reason why I bring up that comparison and talk about that in our director segment, right? Because we're talking about why this movie fell short, and obviously James Wan probably is a big part of that. There's still I don't know, there's 4 good Halloween movies, really good ones out of a 13 film series.
It's Halloween 2, the reboot, even though I didn't like it. And then what I heard, what was the other good one that people really liked? I heard Halloween 3, even though that wasn't really attached to it. People liked it because it was anthology based, wasn't that it?
Yeah, the Season of the Witch. But where I was going with that is, it's this franchise, this Conjuring universe, the bar just is higher, I think. Even their worst films are better than those other franchises' worst films. And it's just upsetting, really, is what it is as a fan, right? As a critic and a fan, it's upsetting to see a misstep, because we can accept them from the spin-offs, we can accept them from a prequel like The Nun, although James Wan being the lead creator and the director of that one, it is a little unacceptable, but everyone makes a mistake, right? Not every at-bat's going to be a hit, like I said earlier. But it's at least you want the main continuity to be preserved.
Right.
And this is just such a stain on that resume.
Yeah.
And so while I do think it could have been 10 times worse, because I do feel James Wan isms in there with the story, with the producing. I think he hasn't produced amazing films, but all the films he's produced that I've went and looked up are solid, and they do well. He knows what he's doing on a film set. It's just, man, this shows the power of the director, because I don't think James Wan would have ever had Vera Farmiga walk around in her, X-Men like powers. They would have never explored that, because you don't need it. It takes away from the mystery. The allure of this is watching the Warrens interact with the supernatural and sort of wondering how she's able to tap in, and then Ed takes what she gives him and is obviously the one who goes and gets the job done. He has the physicality, she has sort of like the spirituality. And when you show us that, it's like you tell film students, show don't tell, but this is the one example where you say, hey, you don't show that, because you ruin the mystery. You don't pull that curtain back. Do you agree with me on that?
I do agree with you, and I think that these are two examples, right? One of which you will know, one of which you don't, because you haven't seen the movies yet. I think of The Matrix, and I think of John Wick, right? Where even though, right, the Matrix movies went in the direction that they did, and they may have actually benefited from having the Wachowskis consulted by some other people in order to pull back on their ideas, the sentiment, I think, still stands. Where could you imagine if some random new person that worked under them but didn't have kind of the amount of the specific it factor that those specific directors had that made that movie what they were, the Wachowskis being for The Matrix, and then Chad Stahelski primarily for the John Wick movies, right? And you have this other guy come in and shift it around for the third movie, not the second one, right? Because at the very least then it's still relatively new, so you can get used to it, right? But it's for the third one, right? After you've had such this good, consistent track record going, it just throws everything off. And in a weird way, that's also kind of strangely, again, a large part of what tanked the most recent Star Wars movies is the fact that, even though we had the adjustment from Force Awakens to Last Jedi and people hated it, by the time Rise of Skywalker came out, the reason why that felt so much worse is because there's only one thing that's worse than changing the thing that you liked. It's trying to then recognize that the thing that got changed was not good and then go backwards, which you never, ever want to see in a movie. That's inherently, to me, the ultimate reason why Rise of Skywalker doesn't work with a movie. And while this is not nearly as egregious as that movie, it's kind of, I feel like the sentiment still stands, because it feels like it's going backwards rather than forwards, which you only ever want that forward progression from your franchises.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, Dom, earlier you brought up Star Wars, and if there was ever a time to bring it up, it's this most recent trilogy. And it shows, even if there is a blueprint, which I guess J.J. Abrams just recently came out and said there wasn't, but let's just hypothetically say there was. Right. It shows how different directors, different creators can carry out the same plan in a completely different way. And I think that's what happened here, because the plan still came from James Wan. James Wan handed a script that he co-wrote, but I mean, hey man, he's the guy behind the series. I'm sure his say was pretty heavy in the writer's room. Right. There's only one other guy anyways. So they handed the keys to the castle to Chaves. They're like, hey dude, listen, don't worry too much about it. We did a lot of the hard work, and I'm even gonna produce it. I'm still gonna be here. I'm just doing Aquaman, so I can't be fully around to direct it. But it does just show how important that directing chair is.
It really does.
It's crazy
it really, really does. It's funny because people talk all the time about how directors, it's becoming more and more like the 40s, where directors are just pawns for the giant studios to push out these specific types of movies. But it's good to see that there are still some auteurs that can survive in kind of this blockbuster-driven landscape overall. So really, with that being said, that's kind of all that I have as far as the director's segment goes. So do you want to get into final thoughts and star ratings?
Yeah, I just want to make one more point there because
Yes.
I thought what you said about that directors in the 40s thing and the way it parallels to today in regards to like it's the Kevin Feige sort of saying, "Hey, just deliver this to me and it'll be
Right.
fine." Whereas the
Kevin
role has
Feige
been
definitely a
diminished.
step up from certain studio executives in the 40s, but still.
Sure, but there's still the homogenization now that you didn't
Exactly.
have back then. You had the unique
Exactly.
touch back then, and that's why I've been so hard this review is because this was some prestige, elegant filmmaking similar to The Witch that you don't really get anymore, and it sucks when you see it just stomped all over, in my
Yeah.
opinion. But yeah, let's get into the final ratings because it's kind
Yeah,
of where I was
final
going
thoughts
anyways.
and star ratings. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. I think the most creative thing about this movie is the title. But the fact that it gets a subtitle in the third installment, it should be an automatic red sign flag. If you loved the first two Conjuring movies, I can't really see anything that you're going to like about this. I think that typical horror fans who kind of are just in it for the jump scares and that overall feeling of tension, they'll certainly get something from that here. But I think that overall, this film does not hold up a candlestick to the first two. I think it's a big step down. I think it takes so many steps backwards as far as the genre shifting. It's almost like shifting back into kind of like more of a generic form ultimately. I don't think the character work is as good. The mystery in and of itself, I don't even think is that compelling because it becomes pretty obvious. It's like, okay, it's a demon. Okay, it's not a demon. Okay, it's a witch, doing like witchcraft as far as that goes, but they're still a demon. But like the demon's not, it's very confusing. Like the plot itself is not well thought out. The story itself is not as well thought out in ways that the first two really were. The first two were so meticulous about making sure that every single little detail was handled and ironed out, and that type of precision was just not there this time. It's not at all the worst movie that I've seen so far this year, but I can't at all recommend that you go watch this. It's funny because we were talking about the theater about like whether this should have gone to theaters. To me, this is a straight to streaming drop. This only gets 3 out of 5 stars from me.
Yeah, I think you raised great points even in your outro there, where I'm like, I just think I love James Wan for his successes so much that I was failing to see his failures. And you're right, it was a bit messy. It was a demon, then it was a witch, then it was a demon and a witch, but that made no sense to begin with. And hey, I think this is a blunder for James Wan as much as it is Michael Chaves. It's clearly the worst of the trilogy. I would say there's 2 ways to approach this. If you are a fine art fan and you see the fine art in the first 2 Conjurings, leave that at the door and just invite some friends over who don't see the same things you see in film and just try to have fun with this because you're going to be frustrated if you don't. But if you're just like a, horror fan who wants to be scared, it's the latest and greatest thing and you're going to have fun with it. But
yes,
my score is going to speak more to those people who want the prestige with the scares. And that's why I can't this might be a generous 2.5. Like, I feel like it should be lower.
I knew you were going to go lower than me. I knew you were going to go lower than me. Even though I think you were kinder to this movie in the review than me, I still knew that you were going to go lower than me.
Yeah, I don't know. I just can't. Because the first two they're just growing on me by the second.
They're just that good. They're just that good. I'm telling you, like, it makes me even more excited once we get to the John Wick movies because, man, I mean, we got to finish Fast and Furious first, but like, we're going to hit John Wick before the end of the year. Obviously, probably around when we do our Matrix rewatch. So, people, that was it. Let us know your thoughts on The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. If you watched it, whether how well you think it compared to the first two, as far as and what you thought of our thoughts on it. Let us know below in the comment section if you think that we were spot on, or if you think that we are absolute crackpots and that we don't know what we're talking about. Either way, we'll take it. Just leave it in the comment section below. Also, be sure to click the like button and the subscribe button on this video. Be sure to also follow us on our social media profile presences, where you can keep up to date with everything that's going on in the Talkin TV verse on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. Chris, where can the good people find you?
Yeah, they can find me in similar places. We run in similar circles. My personal profiles and the podcast, that being Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Christian Evanko. Evanko spelled Evanko. I make music, which I would love for you to go listen to, and you can find that through the link in my bio. I have another podcast called Talkin with Andrew and Chris, a show about life, music, and everything in between. Also in the link in my bio, spelled the same way we spell talking here. And the last thing I want you guys to do is go follow my friend Dom. on social media. He's pretty funny, and I don't think he gives himself enough credit. So
it's funny because like people have been telling me that, like, I've been noticing though that like my reactions and my tangents are starting to get like a lot more laughs out of people. So I'm like, I don't know, maybe I do need to start like looking more into stand-up comedy as far as that goes. You know, just like I just use it as like my therapy. I'm just unloading on people, and it's kind of really rewarding and therapeutic as far as that sense goes. And you can find all of that. I don't know, I might start making some demo tracks and putting them on my Instagram, which you can find at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. Let me know if you think I should start my own stand-up comedy album, and let us know your thoughts again on this movie, and on all of our videos. We've got so much more content coming to you guys next week. It is another HBO Max drop and another very, very anticipated movie that a lot of people have already seen, like with early screeners, that being Lin-Manuel Miranda and John M. Chu's In the Heights. We've also got 2 days from now, Fast and Furious 6 with the next installment in our Fast and Furious First Time Watch series. We'll be back this Friday with the next Variety Hour. And of course, be sure to stay tuned. And of course, if you didn't already check out last night's episode of Talkin Thrones. It was a great episode. I actually had this guy on with me, and it was a lot of fun talking about a certain particular character's death. All of that and more you could find on the Talkin TV channel by once again subscribing to it. As always, people, remember 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.